My name is Bruce DelValle, and I am absolutely honored to be here. I'm a constitutional law litigator and an international litigator, and I work with the National Interest Foundation, and always gratified to be involved in anything that Khalid Zabrina is involved in, because he, to my mind, is the leading voice for clarity in establishing American foreign policy and reasonable and rational foreign policy. And I'd like for everyone here to give him a round of applause for doing this work today. I'd also like to thank Jacob van Veldhuizen, who is from Iowa, and he's Dutch. So I asked him, did he like PSV Eindhoven or Ajax? He had no idea what I was talking about. But he handled every adversity, much like the great Johan Cruyff handled the ball. Deftly, beautifully, and with style. And I'd like everyone to give him a round of applause too for Jacob. Now, our third panel, the materials don't really reference the title, but you see it there. It's called The Unseen Hand, U.S. Foreign Policy and the Influence of Foreign Interests. And I must say, with all humility and gratitude, I had something to do with crafting that title, with the most fervent of hopes that I would not have to participate in any manner on that panel. But here we are. It sounds a little dramatic, the unseen hand, but I think what we're going to talk about today is the influence that outsiders, people outside of the United States, or outside of participants in the government, mostly here in the halls of Congress where we find ourselves, foreign interest groups and foreign governments. So what influence do they have on American foreign policy? Who influences them? How do they do the influencing? Real-world examples of the influence and the effects of this influence on foreign policy. Now, to some people's minds, this is almost like a non-topic topic. Everybody knows that there's foreign policy influence, right? Everybody knows there's lobbyists. Everybody knows what K Street is. Well, I'm here to tell you that outside the boundary, no one knows. No one really knows how our government works and how it functions. Most Americans have no idea. They have some vague concept that there might be lobbyists out there influencing foreign policy, but they don't know. Most Americans only know what they know, and they know what they are told and what they read. And that's not necessarily bad, and in some ways it's a saving grace. So one of the challenges I see for anyone that wants to influence foreign policy is to bring to the fore issues relating to foreign policy that no one knows. I'd be willing to bet you that if we took 20,000 people throughout America and asked them if the UAE were a staunch ally and did everything you wanted them to do, they would say, sure. We like those guys, right? Don't we like those guys? And Saudi Arabia, yeah, they're okay. There's that thing with the planes, but they're okay too. They're not a destabilizing influence. And Israel is only trying to be Israel, so they don't destabilize anything. And I'm only talking about one part of the world. If we talked about the entirety of the globe, we would find that a lot of what we do from a foreign policy perspective in this country currently is advised by knowledge, by what people know, what they've been told, what they hear about. A lot of congressmen don't know as much about foreign policy as we would hope, because all they know is what they've been told by people that walk into their offices. So maybe that's the challenge, it's a knowledge-based concept rather than good and evil. I'd like to start out with our first speaker, Leah Whitson. She's the executive director of Democracy for the Arab World Now, which has a remarkably wonderful acronym of DAWN. It's very evocative and very appropriate. Ms. Whitson is the executive director of DAWN, and previously she served as the executive director of Khalid Al-Jabri in the Middle East and North Africa division in the 2001-2020. She oversaw the work in the division in 19 countries. Ms. Whitson has led dozens of advocacy and investigative missions throughout the region, focusing on issues of armed conflict, accountability, legal reform, migrant workers, and human rights. Ms. Whitson is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, is on the board of the International Center of Justice for Palestinians, Artistic Freedom Initiative, Freedom Forward, ALQST for Human Rights, and the Sinai Foundation for Human Rights. And as a fun and interesting fact, her education mirrors that of Bruce Fine. She went to Berkeley and then she went to Harvard Law School. Still find that she's a little more appealing to Mr. Fine to use in But without further ado, I would like to continue Leah Whitson.
Thank you. Okay, so makes everyone who's been here all day and sticking it out for the last panel. That's also a special point of gratitude for you here. I want to use my time to examine what we've been describing as the interests that successive administrations have pursued in the Middle East, to really question their benefit to the American people and illustrate how they are, in fact, tremendously influenced by foreign interests. I believe it is the influence of these foreign interests that keeps the U.S. locked into a fairly consistent approach, either Republican or Democrat, to incentivizing a continuation, even an expansion of the status quo, despite the harms both to the American people and the people of the region, and punishing policymakers who try to deviate from that approach. I want to then reflect on the dangers of these foreign influences to our own democratic system, I think largely overlooked, little understood, and what I think we could do to stop it. I hope it's not controversial to say that U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East has been undergirded by three primary goals, and using the term goals and not interests deliberately. I'm sorry. And one overriding, though even less spoken goal that governs, I think, all of U.S. foreign policy, and Sahab alluded to, again, none of which I believe actually serve the interests of the American people. Cheap oil. I know one question brought that up. I think cheap oil is the closest to at least a short-term interest of Americans. And obtaining cheap oil from the Gulf is something that our government in exchange provides security and protection for the dictatorships that rule these countries as monarchies and emirates and rulers. So our desire for cheap oil is an interest that often clashes with the interests of oil producers, who of course prefer expensive oil to maximize their profits, and so is sometimes a source of contention. The ability of our country to secure cheap oil on the basis of its partnerships with oil-producing states is shrinking rapidly, as we saw most recently in October and in March, when Saudi Arabia, as the lead member of OPEC, rebuffed desperate Biden administration requests for increased oil output. Instead, they decreased output, securing massive windfall profits for Saudi Arabia, of course, for OPEC members, and Russia, of course. So instead, our so-called partners in Saudi and the UAE actually require that the U.S. give them something concrete in return. It's not about partnership, it's a transactional relationship. Right now, what they want in exchange for cheap oil is more advanced weapons, bilateral security guarantees, of course, military protection, infamous American muscle, and even, of course, sovereign immunity for the Saudi Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, in U.S. lawsuits against him, including Arab organization Bin Bernal Jamal Khashoggi, Khalid's lawsuit against Mohammed bin Salman for the kidnapping of their siblings, Big U. And I think this, again, highlights the very transactional nature of our Gulf partners in the Gulf, who are perfectly confident in their ability to just say no, even after the Biden administration granted Mohammed bin Salman and they had promised additional weapons sales during the infamous fist bump meeting in Jeddah last July. Cheap oil, however, is of course at odds with long-term interests of the American people to transition away from fossil fuels and invest in oil alternatives. But what it does do is allow each administration to punt the painful transition and kick the energy sufficiency can down the road to the next administration. It also, of course, clashes with long-term survival of Americans and every other human on this planet, given the environmental impacts and climate change. But most critically, the true cost of our cheap oil, when we manage to get it, shouldn't be measured just by today's price at the pump, but should factor in the much higher costs of the dangerous, harmful political and military concessions we make to these governments in order to at least sometimes get cheap oil. Israel. Israel is a central goal or interest of successive American administrations who describe it as unconditional support, coupled, of course, with the nearly $4 billion in military aid and unlimited political protection globally. And we justify that, or administrations justify that, under the guise of shared values, and even I heard the word used, love for Israel. Apparently one needs to declare one's love for Israel in order to obtain a Senate confirmation hearing, as we might recall Samantha Power's prior testimony in the Senate. So it's never really sold as a strategic or national interest per se. Indeed, I think looking at the facts, American support for Israel has historically been a liability, putting us at odds with Arab and Muslim states in particular, and undermining America's global standing and credibility as a bastion of human rights and the rule of law. The Abraham Accords have certainly put a dent in unified Arab opposition to Israel's abuse of the Palestinians, but again, the costs that we have paid, not Israel, including recognition of Morocco's annexation of Western Sahara and bolstering the military rulers of Sudan in order to get them to sign Abraham Accords with Israel, have borne tremendous costs. And of course, we're seeing some of those costs in Sudan today. Broad public recognition of Israel's status as an apartheid state and the tilt towards authoritarian extremism in Israel proper makes the shared values claim a harder and harder claim to make with a straight face, of course. But as Sahal, I think, alluded to, foreign policy is the least democratic of all U.S. policies where public opinion matters the least. And so the influence of pro-Israel lobbying groups, both in terms of the financial rewards to candidates and officials who support Israel and the punishments for those who don't, is well understood in maintaining our government's continued support for Israel, even as support for Israel within the American public shrinks. Weapons sales are our government's third main goal in the Middle East. And here again, while the benefits to defense companies and foreign governments who receive our weapons are clear, the benefits to the American people are not. Two Middle Eastern countries, Saudi Arabia and UAE, are the largest purchasers of U.S. weapons in the world, and American taxpayers, of course, gift billions in weapons to Israel, Jordan, and Egypt, despite their extremely troubling human rights records. What's interesting and important to note is that American administrations have limited ability to halt weapons sales, even when they say they want to, and even promise to, as President Biden did on the campaign trail, when he promised to end weapons transfers to Saudi Arabia. This is because every administration is incentivized by the defense industry, working in tandem with foreign governments to reward policymakers who continue to sell weapons with campaign funds and future jobs, and punish them if they try to end, suspend, or even condition a small portion of weapons transfers to abusive Middle East governments. I think this brings me to the larger observation that the long-standing policy of American support to the abusive governments of the Middle East by way of military and political protection is rooted in the, I think, increasingly dubious belief or mythology that this creates and maintains U.S. hegemony, and then U.S. hegemony in the Middle East is good because it gives America influence and control in the region. I think the facts show that while our influence and control is limited and shrinking, the costs of this approach are costly and increasing. So providing weapons, the argument goes, ensures the Middle East governments are dependent on U.S. parts, supplies, maintenance, operations, trading, etc., especially when they're supplemented by the protection of a U.S. military umbrella, like the newly established Middle East Air Defense Alliance, and therefore, these governments, they argue those, will be susceptible to U.S. influence and control. This is part of the mindset that sees the Middle East as a chessboard that must remain under U.S. influence and control to keep out global competitors like Russia and China. But the supposed influence has really been quite limited. Beyond securing cheap oil and protection for Israel, neither of which, as I've said, are actually in the interests of the American people, there's been little gain where the U.S. has sought influence, for example, in promoting democracy and human rights or preventing wars. And it's working even less today, and I think something we should really encourage our legislators to wrap their heads around, as the expanded power and wealth of Gulf states, who are the real elements of the new multipolarity in the region and even the world, has given them the upper hand in their relationship with the United States, snubbing us on oil output, snubbing us on support for Ukraine, snubbing us as they continue with gross abuses undeterred, snubbing us as they dramatically expand their military and economic ties with Russia and China. Nevertheless, the mythology that military hegemony creates actual American political influence is a persistent and largely unquestioned illusion. So what explains what in fact is America's anomalous Middle East foreign policy? It's anomalous with our stated values, particularly democracy and human rights, which President Biden has described as of existential importance to the United States in its global competition against the autocracy world of Russia and China and increase in populism. Is, I believe, in very important part attributable to the influence of foreign interests. What I fear is that the influence of these foreign interests will soon exceed the power and influence of even domestic corporate interests, like, say, the tobacco or gun or even defense lobbying industries. Israel's interest in the U.S. government, Israel's influence, is, of course, the North Star to which all countries around the world aspire, but they are buffeted by a domestic lobby of wealthy and well-organized pro-Israeli Americans that traditionally has included primarily Jewish Americans, but now also includes Christian evangelicals. This lobby can effectively finance and support candidates and parties who promise unquestioned support for Israel, but more frighteningly, punish candidates and officials who speak critically or question U.S. support for Israel. Increasingly, Saudi, UAE, and other Gulf states have gotten into the influence game, bankrolling several key street lobbyists with Ivy Hoffman songs. These lobbyists are typically former government officials who use their influence and ties to pave the way for their ultimate bosses, ensuring continued U.S. military affection for that. And I'd like to name a few of these infamous lobbyists, like Nadim El-Shami, the former Speaker's Chief of Staff, who now is a lobbyist for Egypt, Ed Royce, now a lobbyist for Egypt, Ileana Ross-Lehitin, who's now a lobbyist for the UAE, Norm Coleman, and McKeon, who are now lobbyists for Saudi Arabia. That's why we at Dawn are fighting to push for industry self-regulation, but also more importantly, legislation to curb the ability of abusive foreign governments to influence our elected representatives. We're calling on lobbying firms to decline representation of any foreign government where there's credible information implicating them in gross violations of human rights. But we want Congress to refuse to meet with lobbyists representing abusive governments. And we're also pushing for the reintroduction and passage of the Fighting Foreign Influence Act, which curbs foreign influence and bars former members of Congress and senior government officials from lobbying on behalf of foreign governments. But lobbying and campaign finance is not where abusive governments like Saudi and UAE have an advantage, although it helps. The more dangerous means of incentivizing policies that continue to support their abusive autocracies is the employment package they offer to civilian and military officials, with salaries exponentially greater than their government salaries and even exceeding what the defense industry can pay them. I think this revolving door to foreign governments, unprecedented in U.S. history to the extent that we see it today, undermines the integrity of the decision-making of our public officials, undermines our faith in our democratically elected leaders and their decision-making. Coupled with the defense industry lobby, it creates an incentive scheme that rewards increased arms and increased belligerence. We're also facing increased dangers of efforts to influence U.S. public opinion through the exercises of soft power while exerting extraterritorial oppression against Americans and people in America who speak critically of their abuses. Meanwhile, the hard power approach continues as attacks on activists and critics of the regimes in the U.S., jail and murder for American critics of the regime who appear on the radar, like the murder of Shireen Abu like the jail of Jamal Nisset, like Saad al-Mahdi, who had been jailed by Saudi for 19 years, and of course, the murder of Jamal Khashoggi because of his voicing in the United States.
Ms. Whitson, oh, yeah, so, quick, I feel a little bit like the night watchman at the Sistine Chapel, but I'm going to have to.
Yep.
We're going to have to.
Last session. These attacks against the freedom of all Americans are buttressed by these laws that sanction Americans for expressing their political reasons, like the anti-boycott laws in 35 states that punish Americans unless they pledge to never advocate political economy Israel. I think these are the dangers we need to focus on in terms of foreign influence and harms which are now reaching the American direction. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Sorry to cut you off. I thought it was particularly useful that you offer solutions as opposed to identifying problems, and one of those solutions is systemic. No former member of Congress should be able to lobby for a foreign government or facilitation of citizens. The next speaker that we have is Mr. Khalid Al Zabrina. He is a board-certified cardiologist and political activist. But like those of us that was a law school where we couldn't do math, he has family to do math. He has two siblings that are currently detainees in Saudi Arabia. He was born in Saudi Arabia. He worked as a clinician for Saudi Arabia's terrorism witness. And he is going to speak about the matters, I presume, relating to Saudi Arabia, and one of the things I'm hopefully they'll talk about. You recently gave an interview which was discussing the LIV law firm and about how the use of sports is a legitimizing factor by the Saudi Arabian regime or the MES, not unlike what Hitler did in Nazi Germany. I can compare the two, but you can make your own comparisons. And what we can do is support, or failure to support, these blatant, transparent efforts to make for self-skill more like for legitimate, like if local seen because of support. Good job.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here today, and I'd like to thank Hunt Corey for the invitation. It's always difficult to follow Sarah, but I'll try to be succinct and make some sense. And then I'm able to read my own handwriting. That's exactly how you go to med school. You can't decipher your own handwriting. One of the problems we face, in human rights when it comes with foreign, policy in the United States, especially with the so-called allies, is we go against, legacy relationships. And these are relationships that have been around for about 80 years, like Saudi Arabia, and been more concerned with Egypt. And, there's the commercial ties, even things, ironically, that my dad still built, like the counterterrorism cooperation. And that's always going to be the excuse why human rights are going to be subordinated to the bottom list of the agenda. But when it comes to, how does Saudi Arabia influence foreign policy in the scene, I'd like to be a bit more surgical, use Saudi Arabia, given my experience as a case study. There are traditional measures that they've been used for the past, decades, and that includes arms sales. They are among the largest arms sales purchases within the world. And what they get for that is actually they get a multiple effect, because you have the Lockheed Martins, you have the defense lobbyists all lobbying for the relationship with Saudi Arabia. You have, manufacturing plants in states where, matters and senators and lawmakers, so they become also friendly in the Saudi regime. And then what they also do is, invest in lobbyists, and then Sarah mentioned a few names. And, although we've seen the dip around, the assassination of Jamal Khashoggi, it looks like now that, people are happy to take lobbying money from Saudi Arabia. The other point is think tanks. And they are very, very important because they do shape up the policy conversations when it comes to U.S.-Saudi relations in D.C. But one thing that I've witnessed over the past probably since the rise of Mohammed bin Salman to power, is what I call innovative influence building. It's related to the use of sovereign wealth funds. It's unique. I have to admit, it's smart, and it's very agile. It's been pushing the envelope in every direction, and legislation is extremely lacking to counter that threat. But just a bit of context and background. NTS understands, like a lot of us in this room, that money is the most fungible source of power. And that's why 2 months after his dad became king, we kind of repurposed the sovereign wealth fund, made himself chairman. At that point, it was $150 billion, mainly for domestic investments. And then, he used it for, multiple things. It was his agile tool to accumulate power. So when he purged all the Saudi elite and the Ritz-Carlton, all the assets were transferred to the sovereign wealth fund, which is called the Public Investment Fund. A year later, when Imam Khashoggi was assassinated, the jets that transferred the assassins were actually jets controlled by the sovereign wealth fund. And then fast forward, 2021, after Jared Kushner left the Trump admin, A2 actually on January 22nd, he incorporated Fairney Partners, which is an investment firm, and the Saudi sovereign wealth fund invested $2 billion with Jared Kushner. So we're facing a new innovative structure where sovereign wealth funds controlled by rich regimes in the Gulf are investing in funds established by former U.S. officials, where the desired dividend is not necessarily financial returns. It's just probably political papers. And I say that because, I use the Kushner Fund as an example, but the investment committee within that sovereign fund actually voted against the investment. And they cited, lack of track record, which I think is a fair thing, the political risk, and also the unusually high management fees. If you're in the investment world, usually it's around 2%. The agreement was called percent, which means that regardless of how well or not well that fund performs, effectively, a sovereign wealth fund controlled by the Saudi government would be paying Jared $80 million a year. And it's all, it's kind of innovative. There is no law, smells like ethically strong. It looks like a bribe, it smells like a bribe, but doesn't violate an existing law. It's not personal money going from the U.S.'s personal account to a former U.S. official personal account, but it is an alter ego sending money to an alter ego, to use legal terms. And that's where I think, Congress needs to be more proactive in trying to pull off these kind of loopholes. What's also interesting, is you mentioned the build of Gulf, and that's another example, because so far the Saudi sovereign wealth fund has put $2 billion, thing like that, something that McKinsey called non-viable. But then even it's non-viable. If you're in BS where you have a fund that effectively the balance is an utility side, because you can still transfer as much money from the old revenues to sovereign wealth fund. It's not like the regular fund where there are LPs and you have a limited amount of money you have to report to them. Losing $2 billion is a rounding error for Saudi Arabia, and if that meant I can use the guise of a non-viable, business venture to, curry favor with a former president who also happens to be probably leading Republican, contender for the next election, then he'll do that. And what has been really interesting is to see the ongoing litigation now in California, where basically one of the biggest things that would come out of discovery proceeds is like how much was practically Saudi Arabia paying Trump to host Gulf events. Is it the same price as history prices or more than that? Is this just a fig leaf and a cover to funnel money from, favorable, government to a former U.S. official and so on? But I do think it's, if you look at that, it's a smart thing that the Saudis and the UAE are doing. Because what they do is they effectively influence foreign policy. They establish goodwill in a sense where they become automatic exit opportunities, even for people who are currently in the government. And I bet you there's a lot of people that say, I have a better track record than Mr. Kushner, and if he can get $2 billion from MBS, I can do more. So a lot of the government, at the very least, I'm going to be very nice to the Saudis and the Emiratis. And that in itself indirectly is a way by which Saudis influenced policy. I was just chatting with Sarah just before we went live, and then I showed her the number of registered voters in Wyoming, and there are less than 300,000. So if I were advising UBS today, I'll say, let's go buy a plant somewhere, spend $2 billion, employ 20,000, employees in Wyoming. You're going to have 2 senators and a bunch of, basically congressmen that will have to. So then, but then still, that these are 2 senators that that would answer to you because you have, a $2 billion plan that contributes to the state's GDP, that 20,000 workers are being paid by, and that's, we don't even have to register FARA. It's just like there's so much innovation going on where you have people pushing the envelope in every direction, but where the U.S. law is lagging in terms of blocking these loopholes. And I know we're all oriented about like solution, and I think the solution is to try and get ahead of what's happening right now, and try to basically get together and be proactive in basically safeguarding against these kind of innovative, influence-better tools that a lot of these Gulf-rich dictators are pursuing in the United States. I'd like to end it here.
Great, thank you very much. Appreciate that. Especially appreciate your insights. We're around the world. Next, we'd like to call former Congressman Tom Davis. He's Washington, D.C. attorney. His practice focuses on congressional and regulatory affairs, congressional investigations, land use, and legislative strategies. Mr. Davis served 14 years, and if my math is correct, I used to be a nuclear engineer. That's 7 terms, right? Mr. Rose around the House of Representatives representing the 11th Congressional District of Virginia, which has grown in both the terms of power and prestige, mostly at once. He served as the chair of the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform from 2003 to 2007, very important times for those actions. And Mr. Davis was elected chairman of the National Republican Congressional Committee and served in that role from 1999 to 2002. So that means he's personally sent me a lot of letters asking me when. I'd like to, the next remarks from Mr. Davis. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I left Congress, for the record, undefeated and unindicted. Attorney. 2 hard ons. If you can't get in Mexico and you don't have any skills, you can always run for office. So that's our mineral. Look, if you don't have a high tolerance for democracy, then you probably shouldn't be up here. I mean, the place reeks of it. I think we all understand. All of those of us that have been in the game understand it. We try to maneuver that. It's easy to blame congressional lobbyists, but what about former State Department administration officials? Foreign policy is not made by Congress. It helps to shape it. You can hold here. It's made by the administrations. And what Ed Royce's influence on the Biden administration is very little, quite frankly. So I think you miss the boat when you go after that. And in my opinion, you do register under FARA, so it's all on every. If you don't know how FARA works, every contact a representative has to be recorded. Every phone call to an office, every meeting with an office, so that you can follow that. Former administration officials don't necessarily undergo the same level of scrutiny, sometimes operating above FARA as influencer or policy advisors. So there's a lot we can do in this area, I think, to bring more transparency. But I think to just label it lobbyists really isn't the way this place works. I'll give you an example. My congressional district out in Fairfax County was 40% minority. A lot of it was foreign born. I had a lot of Salvadorians out there. Now, El Salvador didn't hire any high-powered lobbyists that I was aware of, but I knew I had a lot of Salvadorian voters. So when it came to temporary protective status for Salvadorians in this country, I signed on and helped champion that bill and get it through Congress. Why? Because this was affecting my constituency in the Deville, but I understood this was in their interest and they were my constituency. And your note on Guantanamo is right on. I mean, that is probably a cheaper way to do things than a lot of other strategic money that these folks are spending. I had a lot of Koreans in my district in Northern Virginia. I never met with a Korean lobbyist. I did meet with the ambassador because they wanted me to meet him a couple times. Didn't have a close relationship, but when it came to the visa waiver program for Korea, when it came to Korea Free Trade Agreement, I was out in front leading the parade. Why? Because I had about 80,000 Koreans in my district, and every Korean newspaper and radio station was going to parade what I was doing for them. It was my way of penetrating an electorate that wasn't always that receptive to Republicans. Israel, we know in the Jewish community, Israeli advocates are very strong in this country. They are very well organized. They dominate a number of congressional districts. We had a Democratic primary in Manhattan in the last cycle with Jerry Nadler, who was a committee chairman, against Carol Maloney, another committee chairman. Nadler's whole campaign is, if I lose, New York's not going to have a Jewish member in Congress. And that was the campaign. And Maloney, who had been a champion for the Jewish community, all her friends, she was telling me, they just deserted her on that issue. By the way, they did elect Golden at the other end of Manhattan, so they have 2 representatives now. But these are campaign issues, not because of necessarily money. They are organized and do give a lot of money, but they have key voters in key districts, Florida, New York, and other places. The politicians are going to naturally pay attention to it. When you take a number of Arabs and Muslims in this country, combining them together, I'll bet you they're not as well organized. If they were to organize to the same extent, they could have, I think, similar influences on foreign policy. And they do in a couple of congressional districts. But to look at this as this is lobbies and closing that loophole really doesn't understand how democracy works. And by the way, lobbying is enshrined in the Constitution. Well, you are allowed to petition their government. That goes for foreign interests as well. I don't think we've ever had an arms deal that's been denied by Congress. We did have one unfortunate situation, if you remember the Dubai courts. You remember the Dubai courts? I voted with Dubai on that. I think I was one of 19 members because of the overwhelming anti-Arab influence that Chuck Schumer engendered going into the midterms that year, or into the election that year. But that wasn't as much money as it was. Israel didn't oppose that. This was basically generated in terms of generating fear in the American public about who was going to run the courts in Baltimore. Even the Chinese were running courts in Long Beach at the same time. So look, as I said, if you don't have a high tolerance for hypocrisy, you probably shouldn't be in politics, and we need to understand that going in. You have some massive macro trends now that are affecting global politics. You've got the climate change, and with that go the migration patterns. They're ensuing with that. That is a huge issue in Europe. It's an issue here in the United States that is going to, I think, more and more shape politics, but it's going to shape politics in the Arab world as well. Wealth inequality has grown, I think, to heights anything we've seen in the last century. The telecommunications revolution means a lot in terms of how people receive their news today. Makes it more difficult for dictatorships and the like by trying to control the minds of folks. And this whole technology revolution, I think, is upending and offering, I think, long-term hope for democracy. But democracy is a messy thing. It doesn't always work. It's brought out in some of your previous groups in terms of some of the groups that get elected. You look at in America, we're looking at possibly a rematch of Trump versus Biden. And you think, this is the best democracy? I mean, we're speaking personally, but this is the best we can do. Democracy can be messy, but at least there's some accountability in that product. And as we look forward and try to understand how complex this stuff is. So let me just address it. I think you made some excellent points on the cheap oil thing. You made some great points on that, but how schizophrenic are we when we shut down oil production in our own country, the XL pipeline and the like? And we're calling up and begging our neighbors over there so that it won't look like we're pursuing this project. As I said, it's very schizophrenic at this point, and it's very hypocritical in terms of how we handle these issues. And as we transition out of a fossil fuel economy, and it's going to take another 20, 25 years, it's going to reshape, I think, the role of the Middle East, and America's foreign policy is going to have to look at that as well. I think I addressed the Israel issue before, and I'd say the last thing I want to say is that if you want to look for an example of how members should act, Mitch McConnell will not meet with lobbyists on address. He refuses. If war members took that, you might be better off. So I just give it to the right there, and I will stop there. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Simon. This is particularly insightful, especially to remind us that foreign policy is not a function of delays in the function of the administration. And it probably goes back to the unseen hand. How we create a scenario where the unseen hand doesn't have to help, it isn't only seen in. Our next speaker is Matthew Hedges. Mr. Hedges is an academic and brilliant scholar, and it's always great to be around brilliance. I hope that some of them, well, often it almost never does, but once you're an anchor. He focuses on authoritarianism. He is a professor of authoritarianism at Exeter University in England. While he was attending during university, he marked his PhD. He went to the UAE to do research, and perhaps much to his surprise, and certainly to his chagrin, and those in the world that found out about it, he was arrested, detained, convicted, and sentenced to life imprisonment with a 5-minute trial. One wonders how one prepares a closing argument for a 5-minute trial. Nonetheless, he was charged with committing espionage on behalf of the British government in '96. Now, going to Durham University, I will tell you an interesting fact about that. Durham is the home to the worst, perhaps the worst soccer football team in the world. They have given up 128 goals across 13 fixtures so far. So, extraordinary university, but perhaps not the place to go to see support. Mr. Hedges does read Hannah Arendt for pleasure, and he owes it to Walt. He's an absolutely splendid man and a brilliant academic, graceful animal.
Thank you very much for the very warm introduction. Everybody else still awake after lunch. So I'm going to just give a very brief so what to a lot of the conversations that have been had today. What has been the impact? Where are we now as a result of these serial human rights abuses and that continuing relationship? What we've basically experienced over the last 2 decades was a focusing on a security threat and not the security threat that represents where we are today. This has really benefited lots of these autocrats who have been able to exploit the narratives, to exploit arguments which have helped maintain their strong position to the West. It's always been about counterterrorism, it's been about stability, security. The cost of it is slightly hidden, but there's always an idea that they are on our side. But as the war on terror has slowly disappeared, it's gone from the front pages, the international global security analysis has now shifted much more to some of those older traditional threats, and also much more of an ideological battle. And this is where these partners are supposed friends in the Middle East. They have been shown to their true colors are on display. What we've seen is that they are not pursuing the same goals, they're not pursuing the same interests. And while of course there are still arms sales, there are still engagements, the lack of ambiguity is on full display. It's very, very clear. There is absolutely no space for interpretation with lots of the developments that have been happening. I came to DC, I believe it was November last year, because I was engaging with people, with different political entities regarding the UAE's relationship with Russia, but how this had manifested in a much more hostile space. It was, of course, quite strange to be engaging a community that was finding it difficult really to understand the depth of this hostility. But look forward 6 months, and it's not just that the UAE has been engaging Russia in a small scale way, but they have now also explored and they've restarted the construction of the Chinese military base in Abu Dhabi. When their actions when they go to and fro, when they keep changing their minds, but ultimately they are going in a negative direction that is directly opposed and strategically organized to be against American interests, it leaves no space for interpretation. There is no ambiguity here. It is very overt and very clear. While it may be difficult for states to call this out, what I've seen really is that the commercial, the private sector is the one that's at the forefront of identifying these issues, because they're the ones that are at risk of sanction. They're the ones at risk of penalties for engaging with the UAE, who has then been evidence to directly be involved in Wagner's gold mining operations in Sudan, with direct ownership and control from the Al Nahyan ruling family. But if you then have a partnership with a sister entity, with a sister subsidiary, you are now also exposed to potential sanctions. It is a very similar question being asked about Emirati interests in Syria and the Caesar sanctions that come with it. The same with South Yemen. We've seen the legal cases open in France for torture that was occurring at Belhaf oil terminal, which was where the Emiratis and the SDC, some transitional forces were stationed. I was threatened with being taken to Belhaf, rendition there, but I told my captors exactly what they wanted to hear. But the adventures, the activities of our supposed allies have reached a point where there is no more independence vis-a-vis the West, vis-a-vis America, because these acts are directly hostile. What's been interesting is that lots of these leaks, lots of these discussions that have come from within the American political system have come from civil servants. The civil servants understand the trajectory, they understand what is really at risk here, whereas the overt political figures have, as we've said, they may be trying to protect different interests. But the continuation of this, the reporting of it, the direct evidence, the tangible manifested relationships highlight that really we cannot rely on these partners anymore. Their ambitions, their goals are not the same as ours, and it's something which will change in time. It's just at what cost? What is the risk for us? What is the security that comes with it by perceiving that these states are actually our allies when they provide a tangible physical national security threat? This is more of a question really for everybody to think about is what that is the impact of having a Russian Emirati or a Chinese Emirati alliance that threatens Western national security interests. How far, how deep can this go? And what does that then mean for our national security? And this is something that I've been discussing as well in the UK, and trying to pursue it through legal courts and access to be able to highlight tangibly those dangers. But because I know everyone has a sugar coma after lunch, I'm going to pass on to the next speaker, so then we can maybe have some questions and discussion afterwards. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Doug Bandow. Doug is a senior fellow at Cato Institute, specializing in foreign policy and civil liberties. He graduated with a bachelor's degree in economics from the Florida State University, the alma mater of Jim Morrison, the Coors. And he completed his JD degree from Stanford Law School, alma mater of William Rehnquist. I suspect Doug may have more resonance with one than the other, but we'll wait until he speaks to this time before. So Doug is a continuing credit in American political thought libertarian ideals, a liberty-centered universe, and he is a paragon, if not a giant, of American political thought and gone and has been here. And he is extraordinary, has always been a constant, I think, to talking about liberty, the liberty-centered universe and the Constitution. He was a special assistant to President Ronald Reagan, and he was the editor of the political magazine Inquiry. He's unfortunately passed. It's the history that every chance to read Summerly back issue, and still ask rather do this today. Thank you.
Well, I appreciate that very kind introduction. It's always a pleasure to participate with that call into the National Interest Foundation. It's a little hard being the very last speaker at an event like this. Obviously, I often like it to be brought to the table. So what I want to try to do is perhaps step back a little bit and try to analyze why we have I think a fairly significant problem with the role of interest groups, foreign interest groups, special interest groups, whatever you want to call them, in American foreign policy. I mean, in this city, politics tends to revolve around domestic issues. You know, Tip O'Neill thing to say, said all politics is local. But it's very hard for the U.S. and anyone involved in the U.S. government to get away from foreign policy. The U.S. is the dominant economic, military, political, and cultural power on the planet. It affects everything. Remember, years ago, I was visiting Greece, and somebody asked me, what do Americans think of Greece? And I said, they don't. Why would they? You know, Greece has no troops in America. The Greek prime minister doesn't tell America what to do. You know, I mean, it's in contrast, the U.S. has troops in Greece and everything else. That the U.S. imposes itself on the world in extraordinary ways, has enormous impact. But most Americans, for very understandable reasons, don't pay an awful lot of attention, unless, frankly, body bags are coming home with us. Something that really ties in to them personally. The result, I would argue, are some bad incentives that deform U.S. foreign policy, that they encourage interest groups to effectively capture U.S. policy. And the result is, not just, I think, a certain amount of unfairness in how policies develop, but it's bad policy. One of the earlier sessions, one of the questioners pointed out the tension between national interests at times, security interests, and human rights. And indeed, foreign policy can be extraordinarily messy. In 1941, what do? Where you have the Nazis fighting the communists. Joseph Stalin versus Adolf Hitler. This is not a very good pairing. An ugly choice was made, you probably could correct the choice, given what was the more dangerous power at the time. That is, Nazi Germany was more dangerous under those circumstances. I think what's critical to recognize is that when we look at the policy that comes out of kind of the role of interest groups, very often it's simply bad policy from an American standpoint. That it is being shaped for others and not for the American people. I think there are two particular problems. One is that without a deep public understanding and interest in international relations, it's much easier for special interests to rule. I mean, the reality is most of my neighbors, don't pay a huge amount of attention to what's going on in the world. What do you know about Iran? I mean, most of my neighbors kind of think Iran's a bad thing or something. Well, that's bad that. You need to sit down and try to come up with, the sanctions work or not? What do you do? CPOA, on and on and on. You're gone. Absolutely not. And it's very understandable. They live in a country that is extraordinarily large, it's powerful, it's economically productive. You can go on vacation whenever you want around America. I mean, America's as big as Europe. And you go to Europe, you drive across Germany that afternoon. So Americans are responding very rationally to the world they live in. So they tend not to focus on most of the kind of smaller issues that tend to dominate much of the policy making in Washington. They tend to focus on sweeping kind of understandings of issues. And quite honestly, it's easy for interest groups and politicians to manipulate. That the president gets on the tube and says, we're threatened by God, help me out, support me, and they probably will. Now, 3 or 4 years later, they'll find Americans dying in the streets. There was no candies thrown at the liberators in Iraq. People are dying. That suddenly they realize they were sowing building bricks. But that's 3 or 4 years later down the road. So I think that's one problem, is simply the foreign policy lends itself to capture. The second is American violence. That there is no other country on earth that has the kind of impact that the United States does. If you gain control of U.S. foreign policy, and you gain control of essentially a nuclear armed power with the greatest military, largest economy on earth, that's really useful. If if you want to try to advance your national interests for another country or your economic interests or whatever it might be. And I think there are an awful lot out there. And that is, there's a huge incentive to do everything you can to influence policy in a system where a relatively small number of people are probably going to dominate making that policy. I mean, Ben Rhodes called blob. It's kind of centered in Washington and New York and some other places, but primarily in New York. That's the central area where, foreign policy is going to be. And the issues are many. I mean, there are a whole set of economic issues: trade, investment, foreign aid, sanctions, subsidies, all of these things. If you're smart, you try to get, your hands on it. And it can be both domestic and foreign interests. In politics, I mean, think of another government, think of interest groups. You want something done at the United Nations, you want something done at other international bodies, you want something, regulatory bodies, EU, other countries have regulatory processes. How can you get the US government involved on your side in these issues? Also human rights. And human rights can go both ways. I mean, folks come in and lobby and push hard to try to advance human rights. But they also, in a case like the Saudis or the Emiratis, work very hard to convince you, please pay no attention, move along, nothing to be seen here, forget the bodies that you've seen along the way, they really don't matter. And that is, I mean, you hire lobbyists for that, and by God, forget, the Saudis are wonderful, they're our friends, and forget all this other unpleasantries you might see. So that is also a very important aspect of this. And then there's a whole set of issues that are kind of military war. I mean, some of that sanctions, I would argue sanctions in many ways can be economic war. I mean, the famous question of Madeleine Albright was, 500,000 Iraqi babies who died, or children who died as a result of sanctions. You can argue about the number, but she didn't. The question was, is the price worth it? And her response was yes. And you can catch that on YouTube and think the impact that has around the Arab world to see an American declare it. The United States has the right to decide the price is worth it of killing 500,000 Arab babies. This is not a very good signal to send to the world, but it's part of that. Sanctions are extraordinarily powerful. See what's happening in Iran, see what's happening in Syria, see what's happening in Cuba, Venezuela. There's also military aid, there's funds, weapons, it's maintenance on those weapons, it's munitions, all of these things the Saudis have relied on to cheerfully kill Yemeni civilians. It's intelligence cooperation, there's a lot of that. And ultimately, either on defense or offense, it's can you get the U.S. involved as drone, bomb, invade, occupy, and remake other societies. And there are folks out there, with the Iraq War, I remember the great slogan was, that basically Baghdad is for amateurs, real men go to Tehran. Next up, we've got a great new adventure to go on. Now that turned out didn't happen because frankly Iraq didn't turn out so well, but there are clearly people out there, interests out there, countries out there that would like to have the U.S. do their job for them. Bob Gates, former defense secretary, was famous for saying that the Saudis wanted to fight to the last American against Iran. I think that's absolutely right. That there are a lot of other countries that Saudi king might ask him why we haven't bombed Iran. The Saudis were clearly unhappy that Trump did not do so after the attack on the Saudi oil facility. So other countries see this opportunity to try to get a hold of U.S. policy, even on the most fundamental, basic issues of war and peace. I mean, this really does matter because Americans die in this caucus. My nephew's a SEAL, and I prefer that he not die because MBS have some agenda. I prefer that he die if he has to, for something that is entitled with defense to the United States, not royals in Saudi Arabia. So what we see here is this mix of incentives being extraordinarily powerful and the stakes being so incredibly powerful. And again, I want to emphasize there are always trade-offs on policy. These are not easy issues. I struggle with this, say, on North Korea and a lot on North Korea. Moscow's regime, but I don't want to have the Korean Peninsula, involved in nuclear war. How do you balance dealing with human rights and denuclearization on North Korea? It ain't easy. But it's not help if people are showing up and have financial and other interests at stake. And that's why they're trying to get you to do whatever their preferred policy initiative is. So the list here then again is long in terms of its economic interests, that come in. It can be trade organizations, it can be companies. So there's a lot of private companies, trade associations, and other things that come in on this. Part of it can be ethnic, political, religious organizations and associations. I mean, the most obvious, I think of the three countries that I think of most in terms of people associated with those countries in one way or another, promoting them. It's Israel, Turkey, and Greece. I mean, oh my goodness. I mean, all of those have advocates. I mean, they have associations, they have their national days, they have everything. They have lobbyists, they have whatever. And it matters to them because this heritage is powerful. But it's not the only thing. Yeah. Ethnic Albanians were very strong promoting war against Serbia over Kosovo. Very, very active. That is, they wanted and they didn't care about anybody else. But I mean, they wanted to save them. NATO expansion, which has gotten a lot of initiative, which was great. NATO expansion was pushed very hard by Americans of Eastern European extraction. They wanted, understand, they saw this in the homeland, etc. They wanted it protected by the United States. I would argue that was bad policy. But for them, this is a very powerful thing to do, pushing. We see that at persecution of Christians. Like you see it in particular groups like Uyghurs, Muslim Uyghurs. I mean, where folks of that orientation say, I want to protect my people. So there's a lot of different folks coming in. This is not malign. I understand exactly why they come in, but we have to understand that impact, on policy. And then there are specific governments. Really are not so much. I mean, European governments are very active. They fill think tanks with money. And these organizations hold webinars, they hold junkets, they hold. Look, and I participate in some of these things. They're wonderful. Very nice. It's great. But oh boy, I mean, again, you think that the main think tanks in Washington are ever going to lobby against any relationship with any foreign government? I mean, I've yet to listen to a webinar in which they say, yeah, that alliance is really kind of stupid, buddy. Get rid of it. Every webinar starts, we of course have to strengthen relations with fill with what. Doesn't matter where it is. Of course we have to strengthen relations. And they bring on people from, whether it be NATO or wherever else, and they agree we have to strengthen relations. So the Europeans are busy pushing us to strengthen relations, as well as domestic U.S. interests who have much to say, commonality of interest. And again, we see this on economic, political, other issues. And I think the Middle East in many ways is almost unique in the perversity of how this process works. I mean, at least Europe, these are democratic countries. Japan, South Korea are democratic. I mean, look at our allies, in the Middle East. We've got quite a group here. And what's, so you have obviously Saudi Arabia, UAE, I mean, Lebanon, Egypt, all of which have active, kind of programs in the U.S. to try to influence the U.S. government. Certainly the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Egyptians, I mean, these are monstrous regimes. And nevertheless, they have a lot of strong domestic interest. Boy, the Emiratis in particular spread money all over, in terms of universities, and think tanks, and everything else. And they all want to protect themselves from charges of human rights. They all want weapons. They want aid. They give money to Egypt, for example. And what's interesting here is not only are they pushing themselves, but their interests are being pushed by another country. That other country sees it in their interest that America be nice to these countries. So what's really weird is that we start seeing the lobbying is that Israel is consistently lobbying a democracy, they tell us, lobbying on behalf of the Saudis and the Emiratis and the Egyptians. Like, this is really extraordinary. On the other hand, the Israelis would be happy now, let's go to war with Iran. So trying to get rational Iran policy is very hard. Because, I mean, the Saudis, at least until recently, and I have to say, thank God for the Chinese. The idea, to me, the best thing you can do is diffuse the Shia-Sunni conflict in the Middle East. This doesn't suit anyone. And of course we can't because we don't talk to the Iranians. But until then, it's what the Saudis and the Israelis want us to bomb the Iranians. I mean, how do you get rational policy where you've got folks operating on that way? So the Middle East strikes me as particularly problematic arena, where you're seeing policy, there are kind of two levels of distortion. It's not just the countries themselves, but it's another country that sees it to its advantage to shape American policy towards the other same countries. So the perversity there just kind of builds itself. We're always going to have interest groups involved. I mean, Tom is absolutely right. Lobbying is protected by the Constitution. We have an absolute right to contact our representatives. And I can't imagine how, I do think there are ideas of trying to prevent, both executive and branch employees as well as legislating and putting more restriction for action on it, et cetera. But I think we're always going to have lobbying. What we need ultimately is a more aware public that understands why it's important to pay attention these days and understands how their interests are at stake. That while they're being rationally ignorant in certain ways, that rational ignorance is costing them very deeply. And ultimately, Washington will reflect that. We will have people in Washington who reflect who the voters say. We will have issues discussed in Washington that reflect what the voters want discussed. Politicians will view what they think helps get them reelected. That's going to come into be through voters. So I think ultimately we have got to press very hard to convince the American people it's the lives of their kids and their families. It's trading interests. It's a whole bunch of things out there that's at stake. So it's an extraordinary challenge, and I'm very glad the National Witness Foundation was held this come because it's here.
Thank you very much, Doug.
Closer.
Some questions? I think we have a question here from guy.
Good.
He bought the food. We use our own talkers.
Thank you. This was an alarming conversation, especially as we think more about how we may not have as much control over our foreign policies and think as voters and citizens. I want to just put a thought experiment, to put a hypothetical, so it's not a hypothetical, but I want to ask a question that is a counterfactual, which is, what if the United States foreign policy in the Middle East, especially vis-a-vis Israel, was not what it is today, that it was not based primarily on domestic context? Because I think this is where things get interesting. And I think that our position vis-a-vis his war is much more a product of domestic politics than it is necessarily foreign relations, which is the reverse of our foreign policy with the Arab countries. So specifically, there have been many arguments, or many academics and policymakers who gave the argument that, in fact, our support, and Sarah mentioned this today, Sarah Reed, is, in fact, our support, our unconditional support, just completely blind support for Israel, has harmed our interests in the Middle East insofar as Hamas being created, Hezbollah being created, the Iran-Syria Hezbollah praxis, the Palestinian refugee crisis, which creates all sorts of problems in the region, multiple intifadas, et cetera, and also has made us very unpopular in terms of being seen as people, as a country that is not largely decided that does not care about the humanity of Palestinians as a people. So, one, is this truly about domestic politics? And I'm curious to know, what are our foreign interests? What are our regional interests as a country in unconditional support for Israel? And why is our foreign policy vis-a-vis Israel different in that regard? Why is it that we don't have the same level of domestic engagement on foreign policy vis-a-vis the Arab world, or other than Iran, as opposed to Israel? I don't know if I articulated that clearly, but I do think there's a really interesting paradox.
I think one of the things you may be asking is if we could go back to American foreign policy before World War II, when we were not seen as the world's leader. You have to remember that the United States as an international player is pretty much in our third generation. Pretty much after World War II, the kingdom were handed over to us by we're in England, and we're, I think, trying to learn our way. But I would present, and whoever on the panel wants to answer, but I would present an interesting paradox. Ireland is an extraordinary part of American life and culture, especially political culture. Always has been. From Ronald Reagan, can't recall. Joe Biden goes over there, embarrassing himself a little bit, but he's all about Ireland. However, Ireland and England had the troubles. And they were killing children. They would do horrible atrocities to one another. And we never did anything about it, because that was not a foreign policy mandate. And I think that goes to your interesting paradox. Why is Israel different? Is Israel different? Does
Well,
anyone
and
want
it's
to?
more specifically, does domestic politics matter? Because Israel is the counterexample, and it does
Well,
in the foreign policy.
Well, I think what we've heard here, as Representative, as Tom said, voters, there are Jewish voters that come and say, look, you don't do this, I will vote for you. I'm not sure the Irish voters did that during the times of the Troubles. But anyway, what is your, let me stop interrupting. Go ahead.
I mean, this is going to look at James Rowe's memo to Truman before the 48 election about how Italy was being treated and everything. It's always been a part of American politics. It has always been a part, it's always been an influence. You could argue maybe Israel's had an outsized and punches above its weight because of the fact that they are so well organized and have keyed into it. Other groups who may have different perspectives on our foreign policy have not been as engaged, and that's clearly had an effect on policy.
And you can never underestimate the guilty or emotion of guilt. The United States turned away all of the refugees and the suffering in the Holocaust. We turned them away. It's just saying, I don't know that it was even when Comic senator that voted in favor of turning them away. I'm not sure how that works, but I'm an independent, so it doesn't matter. But the concept of guilt and how it works in a society is very prevalent.
I wouldn't underestimate the role of Ireland in American politics. Ironically, that doesn't turn from Ireland on Sunday. And they have lots of memorials and museums about the starvation and the mass immigration. And in one of the memorials about mass immigration is a huge picture of presidential legend. I mean, they celebrate John F. Kennedy. And even in terms of intervention, well, the U.S. didn't get involved. My dad was Air Force. We were in the U.K. during the Troubles, and it was monstrously complicated. But it was also Cold War. So to some degree, that dampened a lot of. But the U.S. was extraordinarily involved in the Good Friday Agreement. And the U.S. has been putting a lot of pressure on Britain to come up with some kind of a border agreement with the EU that doesn't separate Ireland. So in fact, and Biden commented on that. I'm over here to make sure it works and do the right thing. So even there, don't underestimate some of that. But I think you're absolutely right. But it's a huge domestic issue. My view here is we want to be both pro-Palestinian and pro-Israeli or Jewish or however you want. I mean, it's complicated because they're obviously Palestinian, Israeli. But we should be pro-both. I mean, my complaint is we're not pro-both. We're pro-one and we don't care about Kevin McCarthy does not give a flip about what happened, doesn't even care about Palestinian Americans, don't know Palestinians. I think we had a policy that was pro-both that said what Israel needs is peace. Israel needs a solution in which all of the people in that area, whatever the status between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean, all of those people live together in peace. That needs to be that's what and we would have, I think, a very different kind of policy if we emphasize that, and I'm afraid we don't. And I want to emphasize, today especially, the domestic politics on Israel is changing. The current government in Israel is, many Jewish Americans are more leftish on foreign policy, and they are very uncomfortable with what they perceive to be a government that is backing away from civil liberties and a lot of other issues that they view as being fundamental to the Israeli state. The strongest supporters of Israel in many cases are evangelicals. They're my co-religionists. And it's based on eschatology. I mean, we can go into why that happens, but that's put a kind of reverse political spin as one reason the GOP tends to be much more stronger these days pro-Israel, almost reflexively, as opposed to Democrats where seats change. And even younger evangelicals are having the same change. So this is it's a very complicated domestic issue.
And never underestimate the value of a common enemy. But if Israel would have never happened, would the Middle East be peaceful? Absolutely. Thousands of years they would fight with each other. They would have probably continued fighting with each other. So there's a common enemy now. Not that that's a virtue, but Israel plays a role, at least from the American government perspective, in stabilizing the region. It's nothing else we're doing to guard the community.
I've been sure. I think we're on time, but we still have time for a little. A Turkish friend of mine told me it was attending the 4th of July party in Ankara, the U.S. Embassy. And he went to the ambassador and he said, there was U.S. elections that year. And he said, you should allow only half a vote. And he said, why? You have a green card? He said, no. Whoever's elected in Washington will affect my life here. It's a fact. And this, he talked about how much America has so much influence all over the world in the military, political, and economy. Having said that, I want to ask Congressman Tom Davis, since you served in Congress for many years. I find the conflict between U.S. national interest and foreign law. It's frequently drives the U.S. into wars that shouldn't really, the U.S. should not take. I remember when Reagan was the president, Israel invaded Lebanon. In 1982, Hezbollah didn't exist. Hezbollah existed as a result of Israeli invasion of Lebanon and occupying South Lebanon. If you remember, 247 Marines were killed as a result of sending troops. President Reagan was courageous enough. He said, we're out of here, just back and left. This wasn't our interest. But we never learned the lesson. Netanyahu came to Washington and he lobbied Congress to go invade Iraq. And we still don't learn the lesson. He's still lecturing us about Iran now. He dragged us to one war, he was dragged us to another war, he still dragged us to war in Lebanon. Where does it stop? Why doesn't someone come and say enough is enough? I think very few politicians have that courage. You know, during the Republican primary, Ron Paul was the only one who said that. And then everyone conspired against him, and he still pulled 27% of the Republican votes in the primary. So I think something has to be done. What do you think we can do on this?
Well, again, look, it's up to voters ultimately and advocates. Paul is sui generis in terms of his politics. Has a lot of cross appeal as a libertarian that goes in his foreign policy very different, but he's able to carry it out because he has other bases within the party, not necessarily because people support his politics. Well, we go back to one other issue. We talk about Turkey. We had an Armenian genocide resolution before Congress at one point, and the incumbent from California, Republican, was going to offer this. He needed this. Glendale was in his district. Glendale has a huge Armenian population. Bill Clinton calls up the speaker and says, you can't put this on the floor. He said, this is going to hurt our relations with Turkey. We've got bases there. We need them. They pulled it off the floor. This Republican's Democratic opponent, Adam Schiff, who's the state senator, then puts that resolution up before the California Assembly, which Rada votes for it, and Schiff comes into Congress. All domestic politics, as you will. Domestic politics has a huge influence over how members act. Doesn't have to have the same influence on how administrations act. You like to think administrations are a little more mature and can take a look at the big picture and recognize members of Congress represent limited constituencies. Unfortunately, that doesn't always happen.
Todd, I would add to your question, which is a brilliant question, the following quote. When no organizations question why the United States has troops in 159 countries around the world as part of their human rights advocacy, there's little space to challenge the conflicts those troops precipitate and prolong, the local political and cultural destabilization they incite, or even the security harm they create by endangering U.S. soldiers. So using human rights as an excuse to use military power puts us in a position where there's no room to question that. And that is an absolutely brilliant quote. It's absolutely by Ms. Whitson. I think that that's a good answer that I spoke for her in her words in a recent article. We've got to start questioning why we're using the military and calling it human rights. It is an organizational question. Everyone here that's in an organization, that's what the organization should do. Everyone here that's an individual, that's what the individual can do. An organization has the power to do it much better.
I was going to say to how a good parallel can be seen with, say, China, where there is, unified support to stop and to create certain lines against aggression, hostility, and a unified threat. However, building on kind of what Khalid said before, was then it's then the power. It's not lobbyists, but it's, in their formal sense, it's the commercial entities that have flocked to China where there is, where they are based because of cheaper manpower, where their interests are there. Apple, Microsoft, you name it. Huge entire technological firms which own huge amounts of industry represent China's ideas in those ways. So there could be an indirect mechanism. It is how intertwined, how connected, but it's actually, and this is when it comes back to the Gulf, it's deliberately manufactured obfuscation, right? That they are doing it deliberately to try and intertwine, to make people a part of their ambitions without them knowing that they're a part of it. It's too late at that point. And I'm also plugging, because this is really where my interest lies. Like, it's how state security, how security services utilize commercial engagements for influence. It's how far away can they be from that direct obfuscation, which is why the Gulf states are now completely overexposed with regards to Russia and China, because there is direct evidence highlighting that connection. But with China, there are still certain steps, but they are a little bit further away.
You've very soon China's going to own most of Africa because of London instead of they called it. That just happens. That's just the thing. Now, China is suffering because they realize they took the dam or the electrical grid or whatever for collateral, and now they own a dam in Zimbabwe.
They own Entebbe Airport in Uganda, they defaulted. So
They own the whole airport, right? So they're not happy with what they got for the collateral, but nonetheless, that's power. And they have subtly done that. And it's not altogether different from what the United States has done in the past before we did foreclose on our interests. But that's something that's cool. That's that. Any other questions?
Hello, I have a question. Excuse me. This is directed to the Twisting Whitson, but members of the all briefly talked about it. We see that Assad is suddenly using the earthquake as an opportunity to normalize Qadis, both in the Arab League, in terms of like hidden aid, and just ruining ties with the entirety of the Middle East. And this poses a huge issue for the U.S., as Saudi Arabia and the UAE are both huge economic partners, and it collaborated a lot against Assad as a war criminal when he came to, or harsh breakdown protesting off of 11. So I suppose the question is, how can the U.S., its Congress, and its current administration balance between maintaining that economic relationship with its actors, but also reinforcing the Caesar Act and reinforcing the Anti-Normalization Act? How do we play both sides without actually distorting any of the issues there?
I'm not sure I understand or agree with the premise of your question, which is that we should be maintaining our support for Saudi Arabia and the UAE, the military support in the UAE, but not maintain or ensure that there's never any support for Assad. I think we should be supporting none of them. I think we should be arming none of them. But the reality is the United States is not supporting or arming Assad. The reality is that the U.S. is arming and supporting Saudi and UAE. And if you look at the war in Yemen, I don't really know that there's that much of a moral difference, a moral betterness in terms of the Saudi Emirati bombardment of civilians in Yemen over 6 years, than the heinous crimes of Assad bombarding the civilians in Syria. So perhaps I didn't understand your question, but my starting point is I don't want the U.S. to arm or support any abusive tyrannical regime.
That makes sense, but I suppose I should reframe the question in the sense that it's very rare that the U.S. is going to give up its economic partners, but we also know that it is reinforcing that it will not re-normalize ties with Syria. So I guess the question in regards to the hidden and unseen hand is, how can it realistically play both sides? Your point makes sense in the sense that morally it does not make sense at all, but I would like to see how does that future look like for the U.S.?
You know, again, I don't think my government is elected to serve the interests of corporations and their profits. And while certainly it is lucrative for American corporations and their economic interests are tied in close relations with two of the richest countries in the world, Saudi and UAE, that's not my government's job. So I want my government to prioritize the interests of the American people and the values that we tell the world that we support and believe in. Frankly, I certainly don't per se object to economic ties and relationships with any government in the world. What I do object to is military support and protection. And I think what people need to understand is the cost for the investments in American economic interests, American corporate interests, is the provision of U.S. military muscle, effectively rendering the United States government mercenary force, providing military protection for rulers and emirs in exchange for corporate profits in our country. I think that's a bad deal.
And thank you for all your questions, and I think that kind of wraps it up. I'm just going to tell you real quick, a story that hopefully will make you feel good. There are mechanisms that people using legal processes, using lawyers, using people that care to pull back military aid. In Nigeria, our U.S. military, the State Department and Pentagon sold Super Tucano aircraft to the Nigerian government. Everyone knew what the Nigerian government was going to do with those airplanes. Those airplanes are close border missions. They were going to use them to bomb people in southern Nigeria, mostly Christian Igbo people, the form which in Biafra. A lawsuit was filed, which was subsequently dismissed. However, before it was dismissed, the State Department forced Nigeria to enter into an agreement to promise never to fly those airplanes south of a line below Abuja, meaning they could not be used against the Nigerian people, which is why they were bought. Those planes had never been cranked up and never been flown. We sold them, they bought them. The lawsuit made it possible so that human rights could not be destroyed. So I hope you find that as a very hopeful story. I was involved in that peripherally, Bruce Wine was involved directly. But that's something we can all do. You have to find out where to fight and fight the good fight. And always be optimistic. Thank you guys, thank you everyone on this panel.